Everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, The Power of Open Source Zeek, formerly Bro, sponsored by Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speaker is John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight. He will be moderating today's webcast. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John.
Thank you, Carol. Just a quick sound check. You can hear me all right?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Let's get started. I am really excited to be here today to present to you folks on this topic. I get to present this about once a year, and I'm really excited because it feels like I get to share a great secret with people that honestly can change lives, because I've talked to people whose lives this technology has changed and this workflow has changed, and they'll never go back to a world without this tool at their disposal. And I'm really excited to share kind of details about how to use this tool in your security environment, because I truly believe that a lot of you on the phone could really make use of this tool quite quickly, and it could completely change your security workflows for the better. So I'm excited because I get to share a secret that I think will make lives better in security. So what's the power of open source Zeek? A tool formerly known as Bro. You might have heard of that. It's been around for over 2 decades now, and it used to be called Bro. So if you've heard of Bro before, that is a tool that is now called Zeek. So open source Zeek. What is open source Zeek? Well, I kind of want to baseline everyone in the audience's knowledge of this tool before we get started, just to see kind of what the experience levels are out there. So we're going to go through this agenda that you see here. We'll dive into Zeek. We'll look at the technical aspects of how it works and how it's deployed, some use cases to show you the benefits, getting started with open source Zeek, and then we'll close with a word from today's sponsor, which is, of course, Corelight. What's Corelight's role in this ecosystem, and what value can we offer you? And we'll close with Q&A, as Carol mentioned, so please type questions into the chat box at any point during the presentation. I'm going to take them at the end, and if we don't have time, I can follow up with you afterwards, since we do have email addresses tied to those questions. So first, a poll. As I mentioned, I'd like to baseline everyone's understanding of what open source Zeek is. Carol, if you wouldn't mind, could you quickly pop this poll for the audience, and we'll give everyone about 30 seconds. All right, the poll is closed. Let's see what we've got here. All right, about a quarter of today's attendees are just learning about this tool now. Fantastic. About 40% of you, you've heard about it, but you've never actually used it. Awesome. We've got about a fifth of you who have played around with Zeek, perhaps in a home lab or a demo lab environment. That's great to hear. And we've got about 15% of people here who either currently have a test of Zeek underway in their environment or are using it in production now. Awesome, that is a great spread of experience. So I'm gonna really try today to speak to all of you, people that are brand new to this tool, but also those of you that actually have it running in your environment. I'm gonna touch on some advanced use cases that you may not be aware of and might help. So let's get started. Sorry, now I can see my screen. There we go. First, what is Zeek? Before I dive into why it matters and why you should consider using it, let's just baseline it. It's an open source network security monitoring tool. It's formerly called Bro, as I mentioned. It's been around for over 2 decades. It's deployed out of band, so it is not an inline technology. It's not like a firewall you put at your perimeter. It operates passively out of band, monitoring traffic. And it does 3 things fundamentally, and it does them exceptionally well. It takes all of your raw traffic and all of its nitty-gritty byte-to-byte, computer-to-machine communication code and transforms it into these rich connection-linked protocol logs specifically designed for security analysts, which means every single field in all of those protocol logs that are all linked together by connection have all the data that security people need, whether that's to resolve a ticket related to an IDS alert or to start threat hunting in their environment based on suspected network behaviors. The second thing Zeek does exceptionally well is it extracts and it reassembles files from this raw network traffic. Well, why does that matter? Well, of course, files are often the vector for malicious code in an environment and an initial stage of an attack. So file analysis is an exceptionally important component in your security toolbox. And Zeek makes it easy to get all of those files off the wire and translated back into the file formats we all know and love. It supports hundreds of file formats, whether that's a PowerPoint or an executable, and it gives you the ability to take those files and then do automated or manual file analysis, or use them in part of an investigation down the road if you need those files. And lastly, the third key function that Zeek provides is insight at scale in an automated fashion. How does it do that? Zeek's actually a Turing complete scripting language under the hood. And that means that if you learn how to program in Zeek, you can write any sort of detection or insight or algorithmic content to monitor your network and defend your environment that you want. Your imagination is literally the limit with Zeek. And we've seen the open source community around this tool just completely take this capability and run with it. And there are hundreds of open source Zeek packages freely available on GitHub that are examples of some of these powerful insights that you can code directly into your Zeek deployment. And it's things like being able to fingerprint TLS connections and be able to start tracking, whitelisting, and blacklisting encrypted traffic connections that you would otherwise have no visibility into or control or insight over what's happening in your environment. So that's the three fundamental components of a Zeek tool. But I've really just described to you what it is. Let's talk about why it matters. Some of you might be security analysts on the line. Some of you might be network security engineers. Some of you might be SOC managers or even a few CISOs on the line. Why should you care about this tool? I mean, there are so many tools out there. There's so many vendors out there, as you know, there's thousands. What makes this tool so important? I'll take a shot at answering that question with a story. Who doesn't like a story? Now, I'm sure some of you guys are sick of hearing about SolarWinds. You know, you've probably made some of your jobs quite stressful in the last couple of months. But I'm not here to tell you a story about a technology or a solution or some black box magic ML that if you only had it, you would have detected this thing when no one else had. That's not the story I'm going to tell you about. The story I'm going to tell you about is about what comes after a breach is discovered, what comes after an incident is published and IOCs are released and a whole industry and a whole community globally has to react to the kind of hacks like SolarWinds from sophisticated, probably state-driven actors. So the story I'm telling you is about these two companies that I'm going to anonymize. I'm not naming names, but these are real stories. And I'm going to tell them to you to illustrate what the power of this tool that I'm telling you about is about. So as some of you may have known because you had to deal with it yourself, news of this really sophisticated supply chain attack broke in mid to late December. FireEye's Mandiant research team kind of broke the story and did the initial research to discover this threat and published a great series of kind of technical dissections of this tool. And I believe the first blog post went up on a Sunday night, which is, as we all know, not great timing in the business world. And it threw a ton of security teams into turmoil having to deal with this issue, namely, were we affected? How did it happen? How bad is it? And how do we fix it, right? The basics of incident response at the highest of high levels, because this became a board level issue almost immediately as it went global in the news cycles. Company X is a very large, very well-resourced, global multinational company. And I'll tell you this, they got that news on Sunday night and they spent the better part of the first 2 days of their incident response process simply trying to figure out if they used anywhere in any global site the technology that had been targeted in this attack, the SolarWinds Orion platform that was targeted in this attack. They were just doing inventory management for the first 2 days of their investigation because they didn't have the power to be able to quickly make sense of all of their network traffic and definitively answer that question, do we have SolarWinds Orions running in our environment at any part of our corporate network infrastructure? They just couldn't answer that question, and they had to go to their IT team and they had to go all sorts of individuals at the company just to determine this basic first step. And of course, the subsequent investigation into where they actually affected and what to do about that took days and weeks to get to any sort of resolution on that question. And if I had to guess, I suspect at some level, they're still dealing with that question because they weren't able to definitively resolve some of those fundamental questions about whether IOCs had ever been seen in their environment. That was Company X. I don't think the security team got a lot of sleep that initial first week, and I'm not sure they got a lot of sleep the second week either. But Company Z on the right had a very, very, very different experience when this whole thing broke. Company Z on the right, they got this news on Sunday night and they sprang into action. And by 8 a.m. on Monday morning, they had a definitive documentation of all instances where these particular IOCs targeted or identified rather related to this attack had or had not been seen, in their environment and the environment of their customers. I should note, company Z is a global MSSP that represents Fortune 500 companies among hundreds of others. So they were responsible for their entire customer base in terms of understanding this attack. And they were able to send out definitive documentation to each of their customers showing them where they were or were not affected by this attack at any point in the last 12 months. How did they do that? Because they hadn't answered those initial questions that I discussed, right? Were we affected? How did it happen? Where and what should we do next? Now, obviously, the response part of that and the remediation part of that took longer time than that, but they'd answered those initial questions in a matter of hours. And Company X had struggled with these questions for days and weeks. That's the power of Zeek. Company Z has Zeek running in their environment, in their customers' environments. So when hundreds and hundreds of IOCs were published related to this attack, their analysts jumped into response mode. And it was a simple query search exercise across all of their customer environments for which they had telemetry going back 12 months or more in many cases to answer definitively, did we ever see this at any point in our customers' environments? What do we do next? So that's one way I can explain the power of Zeek to you. You don't want to be Company X because inevitably there will be a next big breach that you and your team is going to have to deal with. And you might want something like Zeek on your side to make your job way easier. And oh, by the way, a fun detail about the SolarWinds attack, the research team that found it, noted that Zeek was one of the critical tools in their research kit that they used to actually identify what was happening and actually discover this threat to begin with. So Zeek has a really, really important role to play here because I think as an industry, we're really good at detecting things we know about, but the forensics response remediation side of the story is less well developed. And there's a lot of companies out there that could be having a lot easier and better and more effective time of it with tools like Zeek to make their lives better. So really quickly, let's just frame this, right? Zeek, or SolarWinds rather, was an attack that was fundamentally unknown, obviously, until it was discovered. So that's T0 there on the axis. And TD is time to detection, right? It took commercial vendors a few hours, a few days in many cases, to develop detection engineering technology to actually be able to detect SolarWinds going forward in customer environments. But past all SolarWinds activity in the past related to this hack, if you were an affected customer, that vendor wasn't going to be able to help you with necessarily because it wasn't known, it wasn't detected in the past. And you as an analyst need to be able to go back to your evidence library to understand yourself whether or not it happened. Now, the challenge, the reason that Company X was in the position they were in is because their environment looked like this in terms of network visibility and defense. They were relying on a patchwork of network visibility points using logs that by and large were not designed for security use cases, right? You think about something like a DNS server log, right? That server log in most cases, the data in it is designed for IT use cases, right? Performance, troubleshooting, monitoring of the physical server itself, right? The data that they collect is not necessarily the data that a security person would need to understand if someone was DNS tunneling in their environment. They may not and often are not capturing that data. And that's kind of why Company X found itself in that position on my first slide there. So, if we kind of look at the tool sets that you might have in your environment running today, some of you might be collecting packets right now, full packet capture, where you're basically making a live copy of network traffic and storing it locally and then analyzing it in tools like Wireshark, where you're actually pulling apart the packets to understand what happened. Many of you likely have IDS technology running in your environment, right? Tools that are designed to detect known heuristics in network traffic for things that are known to be bad. And then, you may have access to any number of network visibility points, things like NetFlow that might be coming from your routers, things like DNS server logs or mail logs or SFTP logs, right? The list goes on. You might be collecting those, but they're ultimately independent data sources, often sampled, which means that they're not continuously collected, and they don't talk well together. The timestamps may not be aligned, the data that you need may not be there, and it being quite difficult to correlate. And these white spaces you see in this graphic here, that's kind of the problem space that Zeek can solve, right? It's everything that's happened in the past that the tools you have in your environment today aren't collecting. So you can't possibly go back in time when you need to react quickly and effectively to major incidents. And going forward, this toolkit here that we're looking at is only really good at detecting the things that are known. And you're not going to really have a shot at catching things that are novel. again, I'm not here to say that this technology, had you had it, you would have detected solar winds before anyone else. I don't really think there's any technology out there that would have done that, given what we know. But the point here is you might as well give yourself a shot. And if you're collecting data in real time, you can, in real time, instrument detection engineering technology, and you can start detecting things within a matter of hours, which is what happened here with SolarWinds. The open source community jumped into action. Rule sets were written, IOCs were released, and within a matter of hours, people using Zeek had the ability to know if they were currently under attack using the IOCs released for this particular attack. That's kind of the power of what this tool is here. And this is what it can cover, right? It can fill in those white gaps by comprehensively monitoring and helping you analyze your network at scale. If you know the past and collect for the future, you are going to be in a much, much better spot as a security analyst, as a security team, in your ability to react, in your ability to hunt proactively for threats in your environment, in your ability to tune and understand the value of the security alerts being generated in your environment. It gives you back the high ground in your environment, right? You don't have to rely on IT teams for access to critical network visibility points because you can deploy it at a single point out of band that doesn't affect your network operations with a tool like Zeek, and give yourself a shot at collecting and catching these things for these next novel advanced attacks. All right, so how does Zeek actually work? Well, let's go into a little bit of technical detail. I've already covered this slide, I won't repeat it, but again, I want to emphasize a few things. It's out of band, so it's not an inline solution. So if something happens with Zeek, it's not going to affect your network performance like a firewall could. It deploys out of band via a span, optical tap, or packet broker who's copying your live network traffic to feed it to a Zeek sensor. It's a tool used by thousands of organizations around the globe as a critical tool in their blue team defense strategy. And it does those three things I mentioned exceptionally well. So how does it deploy? Well, it's out of band. It requires you to hook it up to a copy of your network traffic to be able to do those translation and insight capabilities that I mentioned earlier. And it can also take in intelligence feeds. It has a mechanism to ingest third-party intelligence. So if you're a customer of one of those Intel feeds you see at the top, you can actually inject that into your Zeek instance and start alerting before you even hit your downstream SIM, right? You don't have to process that alert at the SIM level. It's already processed by Zeek about known threats. And you can also inject, as you see there in the bottom, environment-specific data about your environment to make the tool work even better for you because it's customized. So I'll give you a quick example. We know of a customer who basically took the IT contact information for particular servers in their environment and appended it to the logs, which meant when there was an issue and a security analyst identified that it affected a particular server, the IT email and phone number of the owner of that particular server was already embedded into the log, and they could just pick up the phone or click the link and shoot off an email. They did not have to go look up in their inventory asset who that actually belonged to. It was right there in the log. So that's the kind of customization you can do with environment-specific data injected into it. And of course, the output, right? Rich logs summarizing at a connection level what's happening on your network, specifically designed for security teams, insights, threat detections, anything that's been scripted, whether you did it yourself or you're using an open source community Zeek package, stream downstream to your favorite data lake technology or SIM platform of choice. Zeek, because it's so widespread and had been around so long, is accepted as a default network data format by all of the leading SIMs in this space, right? Splunk has mapped the Zeek data format back to the Splunk data schema. So it's a tool that's kind of a best kept secret and yet widely used at the same time. That's kind of hard to reconcile, right? But the answer to that question is there's usually one or two people at some of these organizations using Zeek that actually understand how to use it and deploy it. We want to change that, and we want everyone on the team to have that level of technical understanding of the tool, not just be consumers of the data and the insights it generates. So let's double click a little bit here on these logs. So I mentioned these are rich logs that are linked by connection. So if you think about it, a lot of logging in the network space is appliance-oriented logging, which means the logs that are generated off of something like your mail server are oriented around the operation, performance, and whatever characteristics you're interested in about the physical appliance, which makes it very difficult because security doesn't really think in terms of appliance-oriented problems. Those are the ultimate end of where you identify the problem, but what you're really looking for is a malicious connection or a suspicious connection or an anomalous connection, right? It's connections that in security are the problem because that's someone who shouldn't be doing what they're doing over your network. And so Zeek, because it's a security optimized tool, is connection oriented, which means it generates these protocol logs, and it's okay, you're not supposed to read the metadata details there. The resolution's not high enough. That's not the point. The point here is you're seeing a spread, a sample of some of the protocol logs that Zeek generates, right? A connection log on the left that's a little bit like NetFlow, but on steroids, a lot more data about the connection. A DNS log, which I've mentioned, an HTTP log, a files log, et cetera, et cetera. There are dozens of protocol that it parses. And because it's connection oriented, the little blue box at the top of each of these logs that you see linked across all of them is a timestamp, and below that is a UID. That's a Zeek unique identifier for the connection, which means as an analyst, when you're saying, a connection was established, I wonder what sort of DNS queries were associated with this particular connection. You click that UID, you pivot in your SIM of choice, and you answer that question because this DNS log associated with that connection pops up and says, this was the context, this was the outbound query. You can answer that in seconds. You don't have to try to align the timestamps between your DNS server logs and your NetFlow in that case. It's just there built in because it's connection oriented. And guess what? Yes, I think a topic on many people's minds when they first hear about Zeek or they're digging really into the technical details is, okay, great. Yeah, most corporate network traffic, it's encrypted. So what do you do there, right? True. Over 50% of corporate network traffic these days on average is encrypted, and that trend is going, higher and higher, right? Year over year, more traffic is getting encrypted. DNS over HTTPS, great example. Well, Zeek can also parse encrypted traffic as well. It's not doing break and inspect, so it's not decrypting the traffic. But the funny thing about encryption is, yes, it removes a lot of visibility in terms of packet and payload visibility. That's absolutely true. But it actually creates a new surface for analysis, which is the nature of the encryption and the encrypted handshake itself, right? That is net new data that wouldn't exist if the traffic wasn't encrypted. And it turns out that there's a lot of juice to be squeezed from those observable characteristics of encrypted traffic streams. So SSL traffic, SSH traffic, RDP traffic, all of these encrypted protocols, right? Zeek can tell you a lot about the nature of what's happening there without actually breaking and inspecting the payload. And you can do really, really interesting and powerful things. I mentioned earlier, you can actually fingerprint SSL connections and you can start tracking them. And so you can create blacklist and whitelist. You can write a heuristic as simple as, I know these are good. I just want a simple notice whenever we see something that isn't on this list, just a notice. It may not be bad, but at least I have visibility into when unknown SSL communications are happening in my network, right? That's just one example. There's many, and if I had time today, I would name a few more, and I think we might get to some later on in the presentation. But let's double click. Let's actually let you see this data itself. Let's zoom all the way in on one of these logs as an example, right? Zeek DNS log, great example of what I'm talking about in terms of security optimization, right? There is no security fat in these Zeek logs that are generated because they were designed by security people for security use cases. So every single field in the hundreds and hundreds of fields that are spread out across all of these Zeek logs are there because someone in security said, that's valuable, I need that in my investigations. So here on the top, you see an actual sample Zeek DNS log. And then below, you see a typical DNS server log, right? Obviously, optically, just looking at it, you can see that there's more data in the Zeek DNS log. Okay, so what? Does that data matter? It turns out it does, right? I'll highlight one thing here that you might not realize. Many DNS server logs don't actually capture the content of the response to the DNS query because it's not useful typically in an IT NPM troubleshooting context, right, from the IT side of the house. But security, we need to know what the content of that response is because that could be somebody abusing C2 or abusing DNS rather as a C2 vehicle, right? A way to communicate with their malicious servers and hoping they can hide in the noise of your DNS traffic. That might be someone using DNS to exfiltrate data out of your environment by breaking it up into small bits and passing it out to their server and their server responding back, yes, please acknowledge, send more, right? We need that purple string in that DNS log that Zeek generates, and you often won't find it in your DNS server log if you look. And that's if you're lucky enough to have it turned on. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to customers who want DNS visibility in their environment, but the IT team simply doesn't want to turn it on because it comes with a performance hit to the appliances. It affects the operation of the server itself to turn on that server log, and they're reticent to turn it on and or share it directly with the security team. And that's That's not an acceptable situation for a strong defense of your environment. As a security team, you absolutely need visibility into your DNS traffic and what's happening. And Zeek can provide it from a single out-of-band source. So let's dive into some of the use cases and really drive home why open source Zeek matters so much. And let's get specific. And I'll tell you some more fun stories as well that I've picked up along the way. So one of the key value propositions of Zeek is that it makes incident response really effective and dramatically faster in many cases versus some of these old workflows where you're relying on this patchwork of visibility to try to do your job. I mean, think about for a second, if you work in a SOC and you're a tier 1 or tier 2 analyst, just think for a second how many tickets you've had to close in the last 3 months that were unresolved. You just simply didn't have enough information to come to a definitive conclusion about whether this was a real thing or not, and you ultimately just had to close it. I'm sure a lot of hands would be raised. It's quite common. It's just quite common in an environment where you don't have cross-network rich actionable visibility at your fingertips. But it's frustrating. I've talked to people that are frustrated about this. I don't know is a really hard thing to say in security because it's all about risk management and about knowing that you're not at risk or haven't been affected, or if you have, that you've managed and contained the risk. It's not knowing is a very uncomfortable place in security. So Zeek can really, really, really supercharge your IR in terms of the effectiveness of your response and the speed as well, right? Who's got an alert backlog, right? I'm sure a number of you would raise your hands if you're tier 1 or tier 2 analysts. Zeek can really help with that problem. It really can, because if you can clear, 5 or 10x the amount of tickets that you were previously clearing, that's that much more of your backlog you can get through. And you can also start to automate, right? Because Zeek is a fundamentally extensible platform because of its programming language, and people have actually built playbooks that automate basic IR investigations that otherwise require manual data appends or manual data lookups. You can actually automate that with Zeek, and we've seen customers doing that in some cases, and it's just incredible. So I mentioned, right, really fast incident response. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. We'll make the slides available after today's call if you'd like to look at this in detail. But here's a theoretical example, right? You get an alert in your environment coming out of your IDS. It's based on HTTP traffic, and now you got to figure out, you got to validate it. You got to say, is this a real thing or not? Without Zeek, there's the laundry list of things you might do to try to answer that question. And on the right, Zeek can get you to those answers in 3 quick steps, right? You pivot off the connection ID. It'll show you the files log and the HTTP log, so you get visibility directly into the HTTP traffic that the IDS alert fired on. It will show you, in this theoretical example, that a file was transferred. You can click that file from Zeek's file log, look it up the hash, which is also pre-calculated in the Zeek log, and look it up on VirusTotal. Boom, right? That's going to take maybe 15, 20 seconds. And then let's say VirusTotal tells you, yeah, this file that was transferred, it's bad. More than 40 vendors are flagging this as bad. Well, then you can hop back in your SIM and you can say, great, I have the hash. I know that others think that this is bad. I validated the IDS alert. How big is this thing? I want to find out if any other hosts downloaded it. So you simply plug that hash back into your SIM. It queries all Zeek logs across all time, and it says, oh boy, we've got 5 other hosts that we show having downloaded this particular file hash. And now you know, and that's fast. I mean, you really could go through steps 1 through 3 in under 60 seconds, honestly, if you were trained on Zeek and using it in your environment. That's the particular example I just described is something that can be done inside of a minute. The left-hand side, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get through that in a minute. I think that might be on the order of an hour plus at least. Quick story time, because stories are fun. Again, I'll keep this anonymous, but I've spoken to 2 different organizations who independently, without me prompting, without me asking, I simply wanted to know how they use Zeek and why they liked it. And they both told me a story that ended with the punchline, Zeek saved Christmas for me. And I thought that was kind of fun because they didn't know each other, but they both had the exact same experience about how Zeek had saved their butts at Christmas. So the first story is a large global energy multinational corporation. And this individual, security engineer, was at his desk, and it was Friday. He had his vacation all lined up for the holidays, wanted to go home for Christmas and see his family. He was out of country, and his boss came to him at the last minute and said, we have a problem. There may be a sensitive SMB file share access that, if it occurred, is a board level concern. So we need to understand if it happened and document the evidence of that and turn that over to investigations team. Now, fortunately, he had Zeek running in his environment and he'd only deployed it a few weeks prior. He said, thankfully, because if he hadn't have had it deployed, I asked him, well, how would you have gone about solving that problem? He said, oof, wading through hundreds, if not thousands of Microsoft logs manually and kind of looking for specific things that may or may not definitively tell me if this file was actually accessed, but might indicate and hint at that. And it probably would have taken me days. And he said, but thank goodness Zeek, I'd had deployed Zeek just a few weeks prior, because that proposition, that investigation was quite simple for him. He knew the characteristics of the alleged file share in question. He was able to plug that in. He was able to look at the Zeek SMB logs, and Zeek parses a number of different protocols related to SMB. It also has file share and various logs it generates. And he was basically able to use that data footprint that Zeek generates with the known queries of what his boss had asked for, and he wrapped up the investigation inside of 30 minutes. And he sent his boss the report documenting what had happened, and he got to go home to his family that night, and he got to go home in time for the holidays. Happened again, happened to another organization I talked to like a year or two later. They were dealing actually with SolarWinds, and as you know, SolarWinds broke in mid to late December, so kind of same time frame, different incident, and you know, same story, right? The boss came and said, oh boy, this is a P1, all hands on deck, we need to figure this out. And thanks to Zeek in their environment, they were able to definitively understand what had and hadn't happened in their environment related to the SolarWinds attack. And he got to go home to Christmas with his family as well. And he said he credits Zeek with that. And so, you know, two stories, right, of just how powerful this thing can be from a response perspective. Let's talk about threat hunting, because that's another key value proposition that Zeek can offer your organization. It can give you threat hunting capabilities. And, you know, threat hunting is something that is a hot topic in the security world. There's a lot of vendors and a lot of tools out there that you know, will claim that they can get your team up and running with a threat hunting program. It's tough, you know, threat hunting, you know, requires study and practice, typically learn from someone else who has done threat hunting before. But I will say this, because I've seen it firsthand. All it takes to start threat hunting at your organization, truly, is one curious person with time and direct access to the right data. That's it. I've seen large organizations, small understaffed teams, single individuals start their threat hunting journey with those key pieces in place. And Zeek, of course, is a core component of that, right? Direct access to the right data. Zeek is the right data for your network. Threat hunts typically often begin with network data because it's broad. It shows you everything happening in your environment between your endpoints, between all of the servers, right? You typically end the hunt or get to, at some point in the hunt, the endpoint level visibility that you need, right? That potentially kernel level visibility you need if there's some sort of crazy exploit going on. But often, and in many cases, threat hunts start with questions about what you think might be happening in your environment, queried against network behavior. And Zeek, of course, is the Google of sorts, right? In this question and query exercise. And so it's a really great way to get you started on your threat hunting journey. And really quickly right here, MITRE ATT&CK, right? A framework I presume many or most of you on the phone are familiar with. It's a framework that describes adversarial techniques and tactics, chronologically ordered in terms of attack stage. So it, in a way, is a successor to some of the previous kind of attack models that you might be familiar with. And what you see here on this screen is all of the attack TTPs that Zeek can help you discover in your environment. And it's quite a lot, as you can see. And in particular, one thing I'll note here is if you're looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, what you'll find is that the first half of the framework of that chronology of those columns, endpoint technology tends to be a better place to start your investigations for discovering those TTPs, right? Because typically that's where intrusions begin. They begin with an individual or a particular computer that gets compromised. And so you often start there, right, when you're looking for things like initial access. But by the time you get to the mid or later stage of attack, you're dealing with a very complex attack in many cases where there are multiple movements from multiple points you may not even have endpoint coverage on. But more importantly, because there is now complexity of movement at that stage of the attack, the network turns out to be the stronger place to look because you can actually see the forest for the trees because you can see those patterns that are occurring at a network level. So you'll notice that the right side of this is obviously quite more heavily represented here in terms of how Zeek can help you. That's why that is. And of course, multi-layered defense we know well as a concept in terms of security tooling, but it also applies here in terms of data coverage, right? You don't want to just rely on one source of data to be able to give you visibility into a particular TTB. Ideally, you've got a multi-layered data source, right? What happens if the endpoint gets compromised? What happens if they compromise that endpoint at a kernel level and the reporting coming off of the EDR agent becomes fundamentally unreliable? What happens at that point? You've got no backup. The network, in that case, could still be capturing the C2 connections, for example, coming out of that compromised endpoint, because at the end of the day, attackers cannot hide from the network. They'll do lots of tricky things to attempt to blend into traffic, to encrypt their traffic, to disguise their traffic, but at the end of the day, they have to push packets, and it's an immutable source of truth about what's happening in your environment, and that's another differentiator from endpoint technology, right? You know, an EDR agent is only as good as the operating system an underlying computer that it's running on. And if advanced adversaries manage to get to that layer, it's kind of can be game over in terms of the reliability of the telemetry coming out of that. But network traffic can't lie. If you're sitting there comprehensively monitoring, parsing, and turning this into a immutable record of what happened on your network, they can't go back in time and change that. So these customers with the SolarWinds example at the beginning, they had 12 months worth of network traffic analysis and evidence at their fingertips ready to go. And that was an advantage in their camp, right? The entity behind the SolarWinds attack couldn't go into that environment and retroactively change all of those logs. First and foremost, because they may not even know that they were being monitored in the first place, because it's passive, it's out of band monitoring. So that's another great example of where you want this multi-layered defense and where the network, and particularly with a tool like Zeek, can really give you an advantage. So let's get specific here. Let's say we were curious as a hunter about, somebody abusing our DNS traffic, and we had a hunting thesis that our DNS traffic was hiding data exfiltration, right? Because often tools like firewalls will ignore and make exceptions for DNS traffic because it's so critical to kind of internet functionality that in many cases, not wanting to interrupt it, some security tools and configurations will ignore it. So you're a hunter, you have this thesis, you say, I believe that an adversary might be using our DNS traffic to steal and exfiltrate data. Great, you've got a strong thesis. Now, you want to go to the data. So again, we'll revisit the DNS log here that we previously looked at with Zeek. This is Zeek's DNS log. What I'm going to show you now is this very specific example of how you would actually do this using Zeek. So this happens to be in Splunk. Some of you may recognize this as a Splunk console, but again, the data, the insights generated by Zeek can go in any platform that you want in terms of SIM, major SIM technology, or even a lot of analytical tools as well, except Zeek data. So just happen to be using Splunk here, but if you've got a different SIM in-house, very likely you'd be able to consume this data there as well. So, all right, you've got your theory. You think, you think your DNS traffic's being used to exploit, or to exfiltrate stolen data out of your environment. Now it's time to hunt. So how would you do that? Well, this query that you see there at the top, I've highlighted the last part of the query, right? And what we're looking for here is we're sorting all of the DNS logs that Zeek has generated in our environment, and we're sorting it for where the DNS query length has exceeded 25 characters. Well, why does that matter? Well, most DNS queries that are human-driven are pretty short, right? Help me find, google.com, please resolve that IP address for me, or I want to go to this local news website, right? It's pretty short queries out if it's human-driven, typically. And even those that are not human-driven tend to fall under 25 characters, not always. For example, ad tech generates a ton of DNS activity that's extremely long in query length and looks like alphanumeric gibberish, not malicious, just ad tech, but an example of an exception. But this is a general rule that we're going to get rid of most of the stuff that we know about, and we're going to be looking for people that are basically trying to squeeze DNS for all it's worth to steal your data. They don't want to make as many DNS queries as be required to exfiltrate data 5 character lengths at a time. They're going to try to pack as much stolen data into these outbound queries as they possibly can. And it's clever, right? They're breaking up files and data sets into component parts, taking those component parts and basically piggybacking them on outbound DNS queries, and then reassembling them on their malicious server side to actually get the data reassembled into a usable file format or data set, right? Very sneaky and quite effective in many cases where companies aren't actively looking at their DNS. But this query, right, starts with this idea that we first want to just take a look at all of these queries in our environment that are exceeding 25 characters. Doesn't mean they're malicious, again, could be ad tech, but it will help us hone in on those people that might be abusing DNS. So we do that, right? And we are now looking at a particular ID, an originating host there, the 192.168 that you see, the connection ID associated with that host there, you see on the left, the UID, and the count of records, right? The count of DNS logs generated related to that host. Oh my gosh, we're looking at 13,000, over 13,000 counts of DNS records associated with that IP address. That's a very chatty host right there. So that host is making very, very long DNS queries and making thousands of them. Could be ad tech, but it might be a deeper problem than that. So now we're going to pivot, right? We're going to take that UID that Zeek generates that tags the connection that you're trying to understand, and we're going to pivot on that UID. And we're going to say, well, I actually want to look at the queries themselves. Please display the queries, right? And so the query box you see there on the bottom right, those rows are the alphanumeric strings that are actually the DNS queries themselves, right? And you can see that it's a long string of at least to humans nonsense that resolves, or may resolve rather, to a sweetcoldwater.com domain, but generally speaking, it's just alphanumeric gibberish in the 50 to 75 plus character range set. So okay, suspicious. Maybe you Google sweetcoldwater.com, doesn't have anything to do with ad tech, doesn't have anything to do with anything legitimate that you can find. Now your hackles are raised a bit, right? And you can go from there, right? And this is the jumping off point for your investigation into your hunt about DNS traffic being used to exfiltrate stolen data. And this is the power of Zeek. To answer these questions with your current DNS visibility, if you're relying on DNS servers, not possible in many cases at all. Because they're not actually capturing the full DNS picture. So something like this that I just explained to a trained analyst, this is again a 60-second quick investigation to really go from zoom out to zoom in and to try to identify something potentially malicious in the environment. One last story related to hunting. It's one of my favorite ones I like to tell about how people use and love Zeek. Back to MITRE ATT&CK, right? MITRE ATT&CK, it's this great tool, documents adversarial techniques and tactics, so you can start to map and understand how your defenses cover all of those points. It's also a great cross-team collaboration tool within SOCs, right? You've got all sorts of teams working on all sorts of things, and they don't necessarily know what the other side is up to, in any great regularity or depth because they're so focused on their problem space. But Zeek and tags in your SIM related to techniques that you can discover using Zeek can be used to foster communication and coordination across a SOC. And a very specific example of that is I got to talk to a big bank, and they were saying the two security analysts I was talking to is they were hunters. That was their primary task, and they were focused on the network side of the hunt, but also endpoints, but primarily network. And they were basically writing these heuristics, like the one I just showed you, right, related to DNS data exfiltration, and letting them run as kind of experiments over a couple weeks or two. And they were tagging them in their SIM with the appropriate TTP tags, right? And then the beauty of that approach is when they all got together and they got to sit with their endpoint folks and their vulnerability folks and all the other folks in their organization, they had a language, a lingua franca of TTP tags coming out of MITRE ATT&CK. And they were able to coordinate and say, great, you guys have provided us coverage over here with these Zeek queries. We have multi-layer coverage from the endpoint folks over here who are also covering those TTPs. These people over here have tagged their heuristics with these TTPs, and these are our gaps we need to address next. It's a beautifully efficient way to understand risk in your environment if you're all able to talk in terms of the same risk management kind of language and measurement in terms of coverage areas. And it was done by this particular organization to great success. And I think it's just one more great example of the power of Zeek. So, all right, you've heard me talk a lot. Hopefully you have kind of a baseline technical understanding. For those of you that are already using it or experimenting with it, maybe I've given you one or two ideas of things you could do with the tool that you're not currently doing. But for the majority of the call, based on that survey we did at the beginning, it seems most people are pretty new to Zeek. So let me just answer quickly kind of, well, how do I get started with open source Zeek, right? It's free, it's open source, it's on GitHub. Zeek.org is a great website. I would encourage you to visit it. It's got great documentation, great directions on the specifics of how to set this up and get started with Zeek in your home lab. There's a Zeek mailing list that you'll find on that website you can subscribe to that's very active with people helping each other use the open source technology. There's a very active Slack group as well you can join. I would encourage you to do that if you're interested. Great place for Q&A. And there's regular kind of Ask the Zeeksperts calls that the open source community runs where, you know, they get together and they bring a couple experts in the field and it's a free for all. Any question, bring it. And they're sitting there ready to answer it and help the community. If you're an enterprise and you're thinking about using Zeek at your organization, come talk to Corelight. You know, we have an open network detection and response solution built fundamentally around the Zeek technology, and we can get you, among other things, Zeek up and running in your environment very quickly at scale. And we've done a lot of things to make it even more powerful than what I've just described to you. So if you're an enterprise and you're interested, you know, in a POC and you're not sure you want to go down the open source path, and you'd like something that can be quickly deployed and tested in your environment to understand, you know, how to use this tool, I would say come talk to Corelight. info@corelight.com or www.corelight.com. Reach out to us, reach out to me. I've put my contact information at the end of this presentation, and we'd be happy to talk you through the options. It's quite simple to set up a POC, relatively speaking. You can have a Corelight network detection and response sensor in your environment very quickly for kind of a free trial, and you can understand whether this Zeek capability set I've described can have the kind of impact that I've described to you that it can have. And the answer is it can. I truly believe that. And even if you don't want our commercial product, please check out the open source community, because I really think that every team out there should have access to this technology. It's too important not to be evenly distributed. So a little bit, you know, word from today's sponsor, right? I work at Corelight. Who is Corelight, right? Well, again, we offer this open network detection and response platform comprised notably of two, you know, awesome open source technologies, Zeek, which I just described to you, of course, and Suricata, an IDS open source technology that I'm sure many of you are familiar with on the phone. And, you know, we give you these network sensors in whatever form factor you need for your environment at throughputs that in most cases, you know, we've yet to see open source deployments that can match these kind of performance numbers. Of course, Corelight has quite an unfair advantage. You know, the people that invented Zeek literally founded Corelight, and you know, the Zeek expertise we have in-house here is unparalleled, and there's a lot of incredible open source, you know, Zeek technologically knowledgeable folks out there. But the core committers to the open source project, they pretty much work here at Corelight, and in fact, many of them are employed specifically to develop for the open source community. And so when it comes to Zeek expertise and enterprise grade Zeek, it really doesn't get better, I think, than Corelight's you know, open source based sensors. And so network detection and response, NDR, that may or may not be a new acronym to some of you on the phone, but that's the idea of the network side of the triangle to EDR, all of which kind of converges on the SIM, i.e. XDR, this integrated kind of cross-platform detection and response capability set in environments. That's where the industry's headed, and NDR clearly has a strong role to play there. So if you're interested in comprehensively monitoring your environment at the network level and getting really powerful tools to do so at commercial scale easily, come to Corelight. We can help you out. And I'll just give you one kind of closing example that might pique your interest here. You know, I mentioned that, you know, there's many reasons customers come to us, especially from the open source Zeek community for security solutions in the NDR space. You know, very simple to deploy, minutes in many cases, as opposed to weeks or months for large scale open source deployments, super high reliable performance compared to open source deployments, et cetera, et cetera. But we've actually done a lot of work at Corelight to extend the power of the platform with our own proprietary insights. And here's a really great example of that. So Corelight has an encrypted traffic collection, which is a collection of Zeek scripts, Zeek packages, some of which come from the open source community. I've mentioned twice now the ability to fingerprint TLS connections. That particular capability comes directly from the open source community. It's called the JA3 script, which is something you may have heard of before, and it's a framework for fingerprinting TLS client server connections, which allows you to blacklist and whitelist them. So you get that open source package in this collection. But it also includes dozens of insights that are Corelight proprietary that our in-house research team has added to enrich this SSH log. we're looking at in this particular case, right? So there's a number of logs and a number of enriched insights that Corelight's commercial solution in this space goes above and beyond what you're going to get in open source Zeek. So just specifically, because I think it's of interest to a lot of people these days, a lot of people working from home, right, is SSH traffic, right? You know, SSH is encrypted. It's a critical tool for DevOps or developers or any number of technical use cases at your organization. And you're like many organizations today, especially with this work from home kind of movement that has happened during the pandemic, you know, you are probably seeing a lot of SSH traffic, more than maybe you saw before. And it's really, really important to get a handle on what's happening there, because that can be a weak, soft white underbelly of your organization, right? That SSH traffic is a direct line of sight into some really critical assets in most organizations. And if that gets compromised, the adversaries get to skip a couple levels in their attack and go right to the heart of the matter. So you want to have a very good grasp of what's happening at an SSH level. Zeek's SSH log is excellent. It contains a bunch of great, you know, details describing those connections that you can use. There's actually an open source package out there that does the same thing that the SSL fingerprint does. It fingerprints SSH connections. You can start blacklisting and whitelisting as an example. But Corelight, we've actually gone above and beyond all of that, and we have spent, you know, money and significant engineering resources in-house to develop Corelight proprietary insights that further enrich this capability set. And these are things like the ability to tell or infer whether files are being transferred over SSH, right? If they're large files or small files, if human keystrokes are occurring over SSH, or it's a machine talking over SSH, right? These are what we call inferences, right? Not necessarily threat detections, because they don't necessarily indicate bad, but they're important security enrichments to a very important traffic protocol you need to be monitoring that can help you understand what's happening. Very specifically, we had a customer when we released these capabilities initially a couple quarters ago who had an issue where they were seeing an SSH connection come in that was completely unknown, and our inference about it being keystrokes, i.e. human behind the line, really got their attention because it was coming from IP space in a foreign national country that they were concerned with. They ultimately ended up getting to the bottom of that investigation, but that key SSH insight enrichment that only comes in the Corelight platform, i.e. that this is not only unknown, but it's a human connecting in from a potentially, you know, unwanted geography, was really the inciting incident or the inciting piece of evidence rather that launched them into that incident investigation. And so just one example, right, of not only are we making, you know, it really easy for you to get started and use Zeek at enterprise scale, we've done so much work to pre-integrate with all of your favorite tools and build a beautiful management UI around the whole package, which in the open source world is a command line interface. But we're extending the power of this platform, and our open network detection and response platform is comprised of these key open source technologies. We believe that the best way to kind of tackle this is through open source tools, because it gives you so much more optionality as a customer, right? You're not as vendor locked as you could be with a black box proprietary solution. You have open source alternatives. There are other vendors out there that support open source tools. It just gives you a lot more choice and flexibility and options. Optionality especially is important in the world of security, right? Some of you might be going through a SIM swap out project right now, right? Some of you might be evaluating new analytical technology from vendors that you're interested in using that can ingest network data, right? When you go with an open source kind of based product, or even open source itself directly, you give yourself a lot more options, because you know, vendors are willing and interested in working with kind of agnostic data formats and agnostic sources of information that the industry has agreed upon are important. And Zeek is one of those critical ones. I call it network security's best kept secret, but my hope today is that you know, all of you on the phone can walk away and maybe share that with someone else out there, and you know, it will no longer be network security's best kept secret. It will just be the default tool of every blue team, not just, you know, the Fortune 500 financial services or the three-letter agencies in Western Hemisphere's favored tools. This is a tool that can really help you take back control over your network and your network defense strategy. And it's just incredibly powerful, and Corelight makes it easy, fast, and even more powerful. So with that, we've got a few minutes left here for Q&A, about 6 minutes. Let me put my name, title, and contact info. So feel free to hit me up there. It's real simple, john@corelight.com, or info@corelight.com if you're interested in commercial solutions, or you can directly email me, either one. check out our website if you're interested in more information. And yeah, if you're open source interested, zeek.org, go check it out. So let's see here. Let us go to questions. Let me open up my tab. Oh boy, lots of questions. This is great. We've got about 5 minutes left. Let me see how many I can knock through. Administrative, yep, easy. Will the slides be available? They will. I will share them with Carol after this call, and those slides will be made available. Second question, how many resources do you need to store and process all of this information? It obviously depends on the size of your organization, but do you have some rule of thumb? Really excellent and insightful question. So let me see here. It's 2 questions, so let me answer the first one. How many resources do you need to store and process all of this? Great question. Highly variable is the first answer. Unsatisfying, I know. A good rule of thumb is that the Zeek data set that gets generated is on average, your mileage may vary, on average, 1/100th, 2 orders of magnitude less data than equivalent full packet capture. So that's one good rule of thumb to think about data set size, right? So it's significantly less data than full packet capture, but at the same time, it's still a substantial amount of data, right, that you're going to need to manage and process and store in your environment. So what kind of resources do you need? You're going to need either, a cloud hosted SIM or with on-premise options, right, to actually store these logs, or you're going to need some sort of data lake technology that may or may not be, a SIM to basically store and manage data sets, whether that's in your own private clouds or rather public clouds that you license through AWS, or whether that's actually locally stored. And so, yes, you will need a storage mechanism because Zeek and Corelight, for that matter, the sensors that you deploy are generating data, but they're not actually storing that data. That's something that occurs downstream in a tool like Splunk. So, Corelight, I'll give you an example. Many of our customers use Splunk, Elastic, Humio, which just got acquired by CrowdStrike, Exabeam, Securonics, any number of SIM technologies like that our customers are using today. So you're going to probably want a SIM because that's where your kind of interface and experience with this data set will occur as an analyst. And then, yeah, kind of rule of thumb, it's kind of 1/100th the size of packet capture. So yes, there are downstream processing costs that come with a solution like this. Actually, Corelight in particular, I'll toot our own horn here. Corelight has done some work in that regard, and one of the proprietary offerings that we've enabled in our appliances and other sensor technology are a data reduction mode, where we've basically looked at all of the data sets that Zeek generates, and we've kind of removed lower value and deduplicated fields, right? So for example, the con log, which is like NetFlow, and the DNS log, they contain a lot of the same fields. You need them in both, but you don't need them in both if you can know that they're the same in both. So we've done smart things like reducing, where possible, lower value, not no value, but lower value security fields, and kind of put Zeek logs on a diet, if you will. And if you turn this mode on, it can reduce downstream Zeek data generation by 30 to 50% we've seen in customer environments. And our customers tell us, yeah, obviously you remove some data, but we're getting 90% of the value we needed out of the data set from this kind of reduced version. So that's an option, a lever you can pull on our product that can actually help you manage downstream processing costs. Let's see here. Question, Zeek makes sense on on-premise networks. Do you have examples of companies deploying in cloud networks? What does the deployment topology look like? Fantastic question. These are great questions. We're not going to be able to get all of them, but I'm going to try to follow up with you guys via email afterwards. Great question. So I'm going to assume this is really, talking about kind of the major public cloud infrastructure, right? GCP, AWS, Microsoft Azure, right? Major cloud providers where you and your organization have proprietary kind of network, surfaces you need to cover and you need to understand. How does that work? And how does that work with Zeek and Corelight? So the cloud vendors in the last 2 years have done a lot of work and now have capabilities to, sorry, that's my timer, natively mirror the traffic via virtual taps in the cloud. So they've now provided that mechanism that Zeek and Corelight kind of fundamentally require to be able to ingest traffic. They require that capability to mirror it. So that capability exists in those major cloud providers, which is great because that's the first step. In terms of open source Zeek, that would be a pretty custom kind of configuration and kind of, there would be a lot of engineering work you would need to get to have it run in the cloud. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I haven't actually seen any open source customers do it. But the good news is that our commercial offering at Corelight includes support for all of those major cloud providers. So we have an Amazon machine image-based sensor format that you can run in AWS, for example. So if you're interested in putting Zeek in a public cloud, Corelight, that's a pretty straightforward proposition. We've built sensors for those environments, and you're basically connecting them to those virtual tapping infrastructures in the cloud environment. Now, there's some nuance there. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it's not crazy, the implementation. We've got a number of customers running it today. Really quick, let's see here. Oh gosh, really good questions. Let me go for one last question here. Okay, here's a good one. How do you handle Zeek sensors with 10 gigs of traffic? The only way we have been able to capture and process that much data is with the PF ring ZC and ZC balance, IPC load balancer over multiple interfaces. We found this setup to be very unstable. That's an advanced question there. That's definitely coming from somebody who has experience, hands-on Zeek deployment experience. If I told you all of our performance secrets, I'd be fired from Corelight, but I will tell you this. We have the people in-house that figured out kind of the perfect marriage of software and hardware tweaks on our physical appliances to be able to basically reach some of these top performance speeds that you saw on that product portfolio that I showed you. We've got a 25 gigabit per second sensor, and we've seen some customer environments be able to monitor in excess of 25 gigabits per second of Zeek analysis in a single 1U Corelight sensor. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer and you're looking for a direct technical answer. I would encourage you to reach out to me and I can connect you with some of the open source folks who could probably dig into that question with you with some more detail. But with that, we really are at time. I went a little bit over. Really great questions. I'm going to try to follow up with each of you folks who I didn't get to via email afterwards. And please hit me up, john@corelight.com, if you've got any questions, and I'll get back to you as well. So with that, we're a minute over. Carol, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, John, for your great presentation, and to Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.